He never raised his voice at her, never threw anything, never gave her a single wound she could point to. He did something far worse. For 3 years, her husband looked straight through her, like she was glass, present enough to be polished, invisible enough to be forgotten. No anniversaries remembered, no silence noticed, no tears asked about. Just a woman slowly disappearing inside a marriage that still had her name on the papers. And tonight, Terry Dawson stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of their rain-soaked penthouse, one hand resting on the cold marble console, the other gripping her leather handbag, like it was the last solid thing left in her life. Her suitcase waited beside her like a witness. She wasn't crying. She was done crying. When her husband finally appeared at the end of that hallway, tie loosened, the one hand pressed flat against the wall, like the building itself needed steadying. He looked at her, the way men only look when they realize the thing they ignored has already started walking away. Too late. 3 years too late. And when she turned to face him, natural curls pinned soft at her nape, dark trench coat belted over a woman who had already emotionally vacated this marriage long before tonight. She said 8 words that cracked the room in half. "You didn't lose me tonight. You lost me in pieces." She thought only one man heard that. She was wrong. Because in the adjoining room, through a cracked panel door, beneath a single amber lamp, a man in a richly textured dark suit sat completely, dangerously still. Glass in hand, expression unreadable, posture relaxed in the way that real power never needs to announce itself. The young Chul had arrived at this penthouse for business. But the moment Terry Dawson's voice reached him, controlled, exhausted, carrying the particular weight of a woman who had buried her own hope and chosen dignity over begging, he stopped thinking about business entirely. He had read rooms his entire life. Dangerous rooms. Desperate rooms. Rooms full of men performing strength they didn't own. But he had never heard a woman speak like her. Like someone who had already survived the worst of it in private and was only here now to make it official. He set his glass down, without a sound, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, young Chul listened. It was 11:52 p.m. when Terry Dawson placed her wedding ring on the black marble console and did not look back at it. The penthouse stretched around her, 60 floors above the city, rain lashing the glass in long silver streaks, the Seoul's skyline bleeding neon into the storm outside. Korean characters blazed in red and teal and gold across distant buildings, their reflections shimmering across the wet floor-to-ceiling windows, like a city that didn't know or care that a marriage was ending inside this room. The space was beautiful. It had always been beautiful. That was the thing about her husband. He had exquisite taste in everything, except the one thing that mattered: paying attention. He had furnished this penthouse like a stage set. Black marble, warm lamp glow, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And somewhere inside the architectural perfection of all of it, he had forgotten to notice that the woman who lived here had been slowly going quiet for 3 years. Terry had not come to this window on impulse. She had been standing at this edge, emotionally, psychologically, for longer than she could name. The packing had been methodical. One bag, the things that were hers before him. No dramatics, no scattered clothing, no shattered picture frames, no performance of grief for an audience that had stopped watching anyway. Just a suitcase. Just a handbag. Just a woman in a belted dark coat who had finally run out of reasons to stay. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of footsteps that had learned to move through shared space without seeking her. The pause at the far end of the hall when he registered the suitcase. The shift. She could feel the shift. From casual to alarmed. Terry. Her name in his mouth used to mean something. Now it just meant he had finally noticed she was real. She didn't turn immediately. She let the rain fill the silence where his concerns should have lived 3 years ago. She let the city glitter beneath them, indifferent, glorious, alive. And she felt something settle deep in her chest that she could only describe as finality, wearing the face of peace. When she did turn, her husband was standing in the hallway, one hand braced against the wall near the antique clock that had ticked through every ignored dinner, every unanswered silence, every night she had lain awake beside a man who had stopped choosing her. So gradually, she had almost convinced herself it was her imagination. His dark suit was slightly loosened at the collar. His face, the face of a man used to controlling every room he walked into, was doing something unfamiliar. It was cracking. "What is this?" he asked. And the question almost made her exhale, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has explained herself to someone who was never truly listening. "It's a suitcase," she said simply. "It means I'm leaving." "Tonight? Over what?" His voice carried that familiar undercurrent, the one that had always tried to reduce her pain to moods, her silences to phases, her grief to inconvenience. "Whatever this is, we can talk in the morning." "That's what you said last March," she said. "And the March before that." She picked up her handbag. Her fingers were steady. "You didn't lose me tonight." Her voice was quiet, final, the kind of quiet that doesn't invite argument. "You lost me in pieces, and a little every time you forgot. A little every time you looked past me. A little every time I stopped asking for things because I already knew the answer was going to be nothing." Her husband pushed off the wall. His expression shifted, disbelief giving way to something sharper, more urgent. The panic of a man who had gambled on her endurance and was only now understanding that every endurance has a last day. "Terry, I'm not angry anymore," she said. And the terrifying thing was that she meant it. "I just don't want this anymore. I don't want us anymore. Because I've realized there hasn't been an us in a very long time." She moved toward the elevator. What neither of them heard, what neither of them registered through the charged silence of their ending, was the sound of a glass being set down on the other side of a cracked door. A careful sound, deliberate, the sound of a man who had just decided to pay very close attention. In the adjacent private room, amber-lit, leather-furnished, designed for conversations that never appear in public records, young Chol sat with the particular stillness that men of his standing wear like a second skin. His dark, richly textured suit jacket sat precisely across his broad shoulders. His posture was unhurried, his expression the kind that reveals nothing and misses nothing simultaneously. He had come to this penthouse for a meeting. He had expected negotiation, numbers, the quiet tension of dangerous worlds, arranging a temporary peace. He had not expected her. He had not expected to hear a woman speak like that. Not with rage, not with performance, but with the devastating composure of someone who has already grieved everything and is only here now to close the door. Young Chol had spent his entire life reading people. It was, in many ways, the only reason he was still alive. He read hesitation and ambition and fear and loyalty with the precision of a man who had learned that survival lives in the details others overlook. And the detail he could not overlook right now was this. The woman standing 60 floors above this rain-soaked city, suitcase in hand, voice like the last calm before something permanent, had been invisible to the man who shared her name. He found that extraordinary. Not only because of what she looked like, dark coat, natural curls pinned back from a face that wore dignity the way others wore armor, a hand that had just placed down a wedding ring without a single tremor. He found it extraordinary because men who could not see what was directly in front of them were, in his experience, men who deserved every consequence of their blindness. Terry stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. And in the amber-lit room beyond the cracked door, young Chul remained perfectly still, for one long moment longer. Then he stood. Not because he had decided anything yet, but because the kind of woman who could walk away from 3 years of silence without begging, without breaking, without performing her pain for an audience, was the kind of woman a man like him did not hear twice. And he had absolutely no intention of letting this be the only time. 3 years is a long time to disappear inside your own marriage. Terry Dawson had not vanished all at once. That was the part no one would ever fully understand. Not her mother, who kept asking why she stayed. Not her closest friend, who had stopped asking altogether out of exhaustion. And certainly not the man who had caused it, who to this day likely believed nothing had happened at all. It had not been dramatic. There had been no single explosion, no discovered betrayal, no night that stood apart from all the others as the clear and obvious breaking point. What had happened to Terry was quieter and crueler than any of that. It had happened in the accumulation of small absences, forgotten anniversaries that she stopped mentioning because bringing them up only made her feel small. Dinners where he sat across from her and looked at his phone with more attention than he had given her all week. Mornings where she woke up and lay still for a moment, waiting to feel wanted, and then got up and made coffee instead, because waiting had stopped producing anything useful. She had been a woman who loved with intention. She had come into this marriage believing that love was a daily practice, that partnership meant showing up even when showing up was inconvenient. She had shown up. She had been there in the specific and unglamorous ways that keep a life together. The rescheduled plans, the silences she sat through, hoping he would eventually fill them. The small dignities she surrendered one at a time, without realizing each one was a piece of herself she was not getting back. And her husband had not been cruel in any way that left marks. He had simply been absent. Absent while present. Physically in the same room, spiritually somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that did not include her, had perhaps never truly included her, and had grown more distant with every year that passed without consequence. He had learned, somewhere in the architecture of their marriage, that Terry would endure, that she would adjust, that her pain would compress itself into silence, and her silence would eventually become the furniture of their life together. Always there, never causing trouble, easily ignored. What he had never accounted for was the night the furniture finally stood up and walked out. By the time Terry reached the window on that rain-soaked night, she had not been making a decision. She had been completing one, and the real decision had been made in pieces across months she could no longer precisely date. A Tuesday in autumn, when she sat in the kitchen at midnight and realized she could not remember the last time he had asked how she was and meant it. A Sunday afternoon, when she caught her own reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the expression on her face. Not sadness, exactly. Something worse. Absence. She had started going absent too, only from the inside. And the morning she noticed that was the morning something in her went very, very still. She had packed slowly, over days, quietly, methodically. Items moved from closet to bag with the careful precision of a woman who had decided not to make a scene out of her own liberation. Her things. Only her things. And the dark structured trench coat she had bought herself before the marriage. Before she had started letting someone else's indifference define what she deserved. The leather handbag. The jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. She left behind everything he had given her. Not out of bitterness, but because those things had never really felt like gifts. They had felt like substitutes. Like a man throwing objects into the space where attention should have been, and calling it love. The ring she had left for last. She had stood over the black marble console for a long moment, before placing it down. Not because she hesitated, She was past hesitation. She had stood there because she wanted to feel it fully. The weight leaving her finger, the cold smoothness of the marble receiving it, but the quiet finality of a symbol, losing its meaning the moment it left her hand. She had looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she had looked at the rain. Soul stretched below her, like a living thing, indifferent and magnificent. 60 floors of distance between her and the streets, the city's neon signs blazing in the wet dark. Korean characters she had spent 2 years learning to read. The language she had taught herself because she had believed once that this place could become home if she worked hard enough at it. The city had never asked her to disappear. Only the marriage had done that. She heard him before the footsteps registered fully as his. It was something she had developed over 3 years. A particular sensitivity to his presence, not born from intimacy, but from the specific alertness of a woman who had learned to read the emotional weather of a room before she walked into it. The way his footsteps sounded when he was distracted versus deliberate. The precise quality of silence that preceded one of his dismissals. She had mapped him the way people map terrain they have to navigate carefully. And the sound of his steps that night told her something she had never heard from him before. He was alarmed. Good, said the part of her that had been waiting 3 years to be taken seriously. When he appeared at the end of the corridor, one hand bracing against the wall near the antique clock that had ticked faithfully through every meal he had eaten without speaking to her, she turned to face him with the full composure of a woman who has already done her grieving in private and has nothing left to perform. He looked at the suitcase first. Men like him always looked at the evidence before they looked at the person. The suitcase was concrete, legible, undeniable, in a way that her silences had apparently never been. He looked at it the way he might look at a document presenting information he had not anticipated and was not yet sure how to dispute. Then he looked at her, and something crossed his face that she had not seen in so long she almost did not recognize it. He was actually seeing her. Terry. Her name in his voice carried an urgency it had not carried in years. Once that urgency might have moved her. Tonight it arrived approximately 1,000 days too late. She said nothing. She let the rain fill the silence between them. The city blazed behind her, cold and brilliant, and she stood in front of it in her dark coat, with her handbag in hand and her suitcase beside her. And she felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, like herself. "What is this?" he asked. "It's a suitcase," she said. "It means I'm leaving. Tonight." He said it flatly, as though the word itself was the argument. As though the timing was the problem, rather than the 3 years that had made the timing inevitable. "Over what, Terry? What happened tonight that's making you—" "Nothing happened tonight." Her voice was even. She had not raised it. She was not going to raise it. "That's the point. Nothing happened tonight, and nothing happened last night, and nothing happened the night before that. Nothing has been happening for 3 years, and I have finally run out of ways to pretend that's survivable." He moved toward her. Not aggressively. He was not that kind of man, and she had never feared him physically, which in some ways made it worse, because it meant she could not even claim the clean narrative of danger. What she had endured was too quiet for that. Too interior. Too easy for the outside world to miss. "Whatever you're feeling right now," he started, and she felt something close off in her chest at the phrasing. "Whatever you're feeling," and as though her departure were a symptom of emotion, rather than the conclusion of years of evidence. "We can sit down. We can talk about it." "I have been trying to talk about it," Terry said, "for 3 years." He stopped moving. "I tried in small ways, and I tried in large ways, and I tried in the middle of the night, and I tried at breakfast, and I tried after arguments, and I tried after silences that went on for days. I tried when I was still crying, and I tried after I stopped. I tried when I still believed you might hear me." She paused. I don't believe that anymore. And I have finally understood that that belief leaving is not a crisis. It is a mercy. He stared at her. His confidence was cracking in real time, and she watched it without satisfaction, without cruelty, but also without mercy. She had spent 3 years absorbing his emotional carelessness, and she did not have it in her to be gentle about the consequences. You didn't lose me tonight, she said quietly. You lost me in pieces. A little every time you forgot. A little every time you chose everything else. A little every time I stopped asking because I already knew the answer would be nothing. The words landed in the room and stayed there. She picked up the handle of her suitcase. Terry? His voice broke slightly on the second syllable, and she recognized in that crack the sound of a man realizing for the first time that he was not watching a threat. He was watching a conclusion. I'm not angry, she said, and meant it completely. I am just done. She moved toward the elevator. What neither of them knew, what neither of them had any reason to consider in the sealed and private geography of their ending, was that the cracked door to the adjoining room had been slightly ajar the entire time, and the man on the other side of it had not moved since she began speaking. Young Chul had not come to this penthouse to overhear a marriage ending. He had come because Terry's husband was a man with particular business entanglements that required, periodically, a face-to-face accounting. Not the kind that appeared in contracts or boardrooms. The other kind. The kind conducted in private suites 60 floors above a city that knew better than to ask questions about what powerful men discussed in high places. The meeting had been brief, practical. Young Chul had said what needed to be said, and the numbers had been confirmed. And there had been the usual performance of mutual civility that men conduct when they respect each other's danger without actually respecting each other. He had been given the private adjoining room to wait while certain things were arranged. Transportation, verification, the small bureaucratic machinery of discretion. He had been sitting with a glass of whiskey and no particular urgency when the voices began. He had not intended to listen. That was the truth of it. Young Chul was a man who had built his entire existence on the selective management of information. He knew what to hear and what to filter. He knew how to be in proximity to other people's lives without letting those lives become interesting to him, because interest was a form of exposure, and he had learned a long time ago that the safest version of himself was the version that remained unmoved. But something in her voice had passed straight through that discipline before he had time to apply it. It was not distress. He heard distress regularly. It was almost ambient in his world, a background frequency he had long since learned to tune out. What stopped him was the absence of distress. What stopped him was the control. The specific, hard-won control of a woman who has been pushed past the point of performance and has arrived somewhere on the other side of heartbreak, where the air is cold and clear and absolutely still. He knew that place. Not romantically. Young Chul had not arrived at that kind of stillness through love, and he had arrived there through years of understanding that survival required the elimination of everything that could be used against you. He had thought it was a place only people like him could reach. People trained by circumstance into a particular kind of emotional minimalism. But the woman in the next room had gotten there through abandonment, through years of being seen past by someone who should have been paying attention. And somehow, that made the stillness in her voice more striking, not less, because she had not chosen it as strategy. She had been carved into it. He sat without moving, and he listened. He heard the measured patience of someone who had rehearsed nothing, and needed to rehearse nothing, because she was only saying what had been true for a very long time. He heard the absence of begging. He heard the absence of the particular female performance he had watched his entire life. The softening, the apologizing, the making yourself smaller so the man in the room doesn't have to feel uncomfortable about what he has done. She did none of that. She simply told the truth. Plainly. At reasonable volume. With the finality of someone who has decided that the truth no longer requires an audience to be valid. You didn't lose me tonight. You lost me in pieces. Young Chul turned the glass slowly in his hand. He was a man who had spent decades reading people for the specific purpose of predicting what they would do next. It was not a skill he had been taught. It was something that had grown out of necessity, out of years of being in rooms where the wrong read could end you. And what he read now, from the other side of a cracked door, and 60 floors above a rain-soaked city, was this. The woman leaving was the most interesting person in that penthouse. Not because of her beauty, though the partial image he had registered through the door's thin gap, a composed profile, a dark coat, natural hair pinned back from a face that had settled into something beyond anger, was not easy to dismiss. But because of what she was doing with her pain. Most people weaponized it or collapsed under it. She was doing neither. She was simply carrying it out with her, packed neatly alongside everything else she had decided to take, and leaving the rest behind. The elevator closed. The penthouse went quiet except for the rain. Young Chul heard her husband make a sound on the other side of the wall that he could not quite categorize. Something between disbelief and the early register of consequences. And then silence. Young Chul stood. He moved to the window of the adjoining room and looked down at the city. The same city she was descending into right now, 60 floors below, stepping out into the rain with her suitcase and her dignity and 3 years' worth of decisions finally made. He did not make a decision in that moment. He was not impulsive. He had not survived long enough to be impulsive. But he noted something. Filed it away with the careful precision he applied to every detail that struck him as significant. The husband had been in a room with that woman for 3 years, and he had not seen her, and young Chul had been in proximity to her voice for 11 minutes. And he could already tell that whoever she was, whatever she was made of, the man now standing shell-shocked in his beautiful, empty penthouse, had no idea what he had been standing next to. He turned from the window and straightened his jacket. Then he picked up his phone and asked a single quiet question of the man who handled everything he needed handled. Find out who she is. 3 days passed. Terry did not call. She did not send a message. She did not soften. Her husband waited for all 3 of those things, with the particular confidence of a man who had never before encountered a consequence that didn't eventually renegotiate itself. He waited on the first day with mild concern, on the second day with growing unease, and on the third day with something that was beginning to look, for the first time in his life, like genuine fear. Because Terry was not coming back. He understood this not because she told him. She did not tell him. But because of the specific quality of her silence. He had lived beside her silence for 3 years, and thought he knew its shape. But this silence was different. This silence did not have the soft, waiting quality of someone hoping to be reached for. It had the closed, decided quality of someone who has already moved on in every way that matters, and is only waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He called her twice on the first day. She let both calls go to voicemail, and did not return them. He sent a message on the second day, measured, slightly apologetic, the kind of message a man sends when he is trying to seem open without admitting fault. And she read it, and did not respond. By the third day, he was standing at the window she had stood at, looking at the same rain-soaked skyline, and experiencing for the first time the particular vertigo of a man who has let something go so gradually he did not notice until it was already gone. The worst of it was not the absence. The worst of it was the recognition. Arriving slowly, the way the worst recognitions always do. That the absence had been building for years, and he had simply chosen not to notice. He had told himself, on the rare occasions when Terry's unhappiness became visible enough to require acknowledgement, that she was sensitive. that she expected too much. That love did not have to be performed every day to be real. He had told himself these things because they were convenient, and because she had never left before, and therefore they had never been disproven. She had disproven them now. And somewhere beneath the hurt of her departure, beneath the surprise, and the bruised pride, and the unsettling quiet of a penthouse that now felt less like a home, and more like a very expensive room, there was something he could not fully name yet. An instinct, a sense, vague and uncomfortable, that something had shifted not only inside his marriage, but somewhere in the wider geometry of his world. He did not yet know what young Chol had heard. He would. On the fourth morning after her departure, Terry woke up in her own space, a hotel suite across the city, temporary but hers. It paid for with money she had been quietly saving for 8 months, because some part of her had known, even before she fully admitted it, that she was going to need an exit. And she lay still for a moment. She was waiting, she realized, for the familiar weight of dread that had accompanied most of her mornings for the past 3 years. The low, grinding awareness of a day stretching ahead, inside a life that had stopped fitting her. It didn't come. What came instead was something so unfamiliar, she almost didn't recognize it. Quiet. Clean, uncomplicated quiet. The kind that doesn't ask anything of you. She lay in it for a long time. The rain had stopped overnight, and the city outside her window was silver and pale in the early light. The neon signs dark now, the skyline stripped back to its bones. She looked at it and felt something she had forgotten was available to her. She felt like herself, not the compressed, enduring, steadily disappearing version of herself she had been maintaining inside that marriage. The real version. The one who had opinions and edges, and a specific kind of intelligence that her husband had stopped finding interesting somewhere in the second year. When the novelty of her had worn off, and the inconvenience of her interiority had begun to outweigh the aesthetic of her presence. She got up. She made coffee with the small machine on the suite's counter. She stood at the window in the early gray light and drank it and thought about what came next. Not with anxiety, but with the careful, practical attention of a woman beginning to architect a life on her own terms. She did not think about her husband. She did not think about the penthouse. She did not think, even once, about the man in the amber-lit room who had been sitting on the other side of a cracked door while her marriage made its final sound. She had no reason to think about him. She did not yet know he was already thinking about her. The first sign that something had changed came not as a confrontation, but as a coincidence, or something that wore the shape of one. Terry had been rebuilding quietly. 2 weeks out of the marriage, and she had settled into a rhythm that was modest, but entirely her own. She had found a furnished apartment in a quieter district of the city, signed the lease herself, carried her own bags up the stairs. She had begun consulting work again. The kind of strategic communications work she had quietly stepped back from during the marriage, because her husband had never said she couldn't, but had made his preferences felt in the particular way emotionally negligent men do, through mild dismissal and strategic indifference, until she had simply stopped mentioning it. She was mentioning it again. She was becoming, slowly and deliberately, someone who took up space. It was during a client meeting at a restaurant in the business district that she first felt it. A shift in the atmosphere of the room that she couldn't immediately source. Not threatening, just present. The specific quality of attention that has weight to it, that lands differently than ordinary ambient noise. She had looked up from her documents, scanned the room with the practiced calm she'd developed over years of managing her own interior weather, and found nothing she could point to. But the feeling stayed. It stayed the following Tuesday, when a situation that should have been complicated. A former colleague who had been quietly pressured by her husband's circle to withdraw a professional opportunity from her, suddenly reversed without explanation. The colleague called to say the obstacle had cleared. He sounded confused, slightly nervous, like a man who had received information from a direction he hadn't expected and was not entirely sure what to do with it. Terry thanked him and said nothing further. But she sat with it afterward, turning it over in her mind, with the careful attention she applied to things that didn't quite add up. In her experience, obstacles didn't clear themselves. Someone had moved something. Someone with enough reach to make a man like her former colleague nervous with a single communication. She filed it away, watched for the pattern. The pattern arrived on a Thursday evening. She was leaving her building when a car she didn't recognize was parked at the far end of the street. Dark, expensive, entirely still. It was there when she left. It was gone when she returned 2 hours later. It appeared again the following evening. Same position, same stillness. Not threatening in any overt way, but deliberate. The kind of deliberate that only happens when someone wants you to know they're there without forcing the knowing. She stopped on the pavement and looked at it directly. The window did not lower. Nothing moved. But she had the absolute, bone-certain conviction that whoever was inside it could see her standing there, looking back, refusing to pretend she hadn't noticed. Good, she thought. Then we understand each other. She went inside. Her husband had also noticed the shift. He had noticed it the way a man notices when the territory he assumed was still his begins to feel like someone else has walked through it. Not violently, not obviously, but with a confidence that suggests a different kind of ownership is being considered. He had heard things. The kind of things that travel through the specific social and professional networks he inhabited. Networks that overlapped in ways he had always preferred not to examine too closely, with networks that belonged to young Chol. What he heard was not explicit. It never was, in those circles. But the shape of it was clear enough. Someone was paying attention to Terry. He told himself at first that it was nothing, that he was reading patterns into coincidence, because his pride was wounded, and his judgment was compromised by the particular ego injury of a man who had been left. But the professional interference, the obstacle that had cleared, the quiet rerouting of pressure that had been applied in Terry's direction, was too precise to be coincidental, and he knew it. He began to understand, slowly and with a rising fury he did not know how to place, that young Chol had been in that penthouse the night she left, had heard her, had been, in some form, watching since. The fury this produced in him was not grief. He was honest enough with himself, in his private moments, to recognize that. It was not the fury of a man devastated by lost love. It was the fury of a man who had assumed an asset was secure, and had discovered it was being appraised by someone else. He had not valued Terry when she was there, but the thought of another man valuing her now, a man he could not easily challenge, could not outmaneuver, could not dismiss, was producing in him something that felt humiliatingly close to desperation. He called her. She answered on the fourth ring, with the measured patience of a woman who had decided to remain civil because civility cost her nothing. "I want to talk," he said. "We can talk," she said, in person. A pause. Fine. They met in a hotel lobby, neutral territory. Her choice. A deliberate selection, because Terry had learned to stop going to places where the geography favored the other person. She arrived first, ordered water, and sat with her back to the wall, the way she had trained herself to sit in the months since leaving. Positioned to see everything, surprised by nothing. He arrived looking like a man who had not been sleeping well. His suit was immaculate. He would never let the exterior slip. That was not in his nature. But his eyes carried something she had not seen in years of marriage. He looked, she thought, like someone who had finally begun to understand the cost of something, and was finding the number much higher than anticipated. He sat down across from her. For a moment he said nothing, and she let the silence sit there without filling it, because she had spent 3 years filling his silences, and she was not doing it anymore. I know about young Chol, he said finally. She kept her face still. What about him? He was there, that night, in the penthouse. He watched her carefully, looking for the reaction that would tell him how much she already knew. She gave him nothing. He heard you. And since then. He paused, and the pause had something ugly compressed inside it. He's been involving himself. Has he? She said. Don't do that. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. The controlled aggression in his voice was new. Or not new, she corrected herself. Just newly visible, now that she was no longer managing it down. Men like young Chol don't pay attention to women out of the goodness of their hearts, Terry. He saw an angle. He saw a way to use you to get to me. To get to you. She repeated it quietly, not as a question. That's what this is. Whatever you think his interest is. I haven't said anything about his interest. Her voice was even. Completely even. You came here to talk to me about a man I have exchanged no words with, because you're frightened of what it means that he noticed me. That's what this conversation is. She tilted her head slightly. Isn't it? His jaw tightened. You want to make this about him, she continued. Because making it about him means you don't have to make it about the 3 years before him. It means you get to be the wronged party. It means the story becomes about interference rather than neglect. She set her glass down, with a care that was its own kind of emphasis. I'm not going to let you do that. Terry, you didn't lose me to him. The words came out clean and final, each one placed with the precision of a woman who has been rehearsing the truth in private for a long time and is only now saying it out loud. You lost me to 3 years of being treated like I was optional, like I was decoration, like my unhappiness was a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to being invisible inside my own marriage. She looked at him steadily. Young Chol was in a room for 11 minutes and apparently paid more attention than you did in 36 months. That is not his failure. That is yours. The lobby moved quietly around them. A couple crossed toward the elevators. A concierge spoke softly into a phone. The world continued with complete indifference to the fact that a woman was, at this precise moment, naming the truth of her own life and refusing to let it be rewritten. Her husband stared at her. She watched something move through his expression. Anger. Then something rawer. Then something she recognized as the particular shame of a person confronted with an accurate account of themselves that they cannot dispute. I didn't know, he said, quietly. I didn't know it had gotten to that point. I told you, she said, many times, in many ways. I know. You chose not to hear it. A long silence. I know, he said again. She picked up her bag. She was not cruel. She was not triumphant. She was simply finished, and she had learned that finished did not require an audience's permission. I hope you figure out what you actually want from your life, she said. But I can't be the one who waits around while you do. She stood. She was almost at the lobby door when she felt it again. That particular atmospheric weight, and that sense of attention with mass to it. She turned her head slightly and found him across the lobby, near the far corridor, standing with the unhurried stillness of a man who had all the time in the world and no need to announce himself. Young Chol. Dark suit, precisely worn. A posture that owned the room without asking for it. And his eyes, unreadable, entirely focused. The eyes of a man who had been paying attention from the beginning and intended to keep paying attention, were on her. Not on her husband. On her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she walked out into the city. He found her 3 days later. Not through arrangement. Or rather, not through arrangement she had been asked to participate in. He simply appeared in the small coffee place near her new apartment at a time when she was there, sitting at a corner table with her laptop and the particular focused quiet of a woman rebuilding a professional life from scratch. He sat down across from her without asking, which under ordinary circumstances would have been presumptuous. But he did it with such complete absence of aggression that it registered less as intrusion and more as arrival. She looked at him over her coffee. "You cleared the obstacle with my former colleague," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because it was placed there by someone who had no right to limit what you could build." She studied him. He met her eyes without performance. No charm deployed, no calculated warmth. Just directness. The specific directness of a man who has decided that honesty is less work than anything else, and is comfortable enough in his own authority to not need to impress anyone. "You know who I am," he said. "I've found out. Then you know my world is not simple." "No," she said. "I imagine it isn't." "And you're not frightened." She considered this. "I've spent 3 years being slowly erased by someone who was supposed to be safe," she said. "Fear has reorganized itself for me. I'm less frightened of danger I can see than of comfort that hollows me out without my noticing." Something shifted in his expression. Fractionally. "Enough." "I heard you say goodbye," he said. "I know. I've been thinking about it since." "I know that too." She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him steadily. "I want to ask you something directly." He waited. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Not what you find interesting. Not what pulled your attention. What do you actually want?" The question landed in the space between them, and he did not rush to fill it. She respected that. The willingness to sit inside a serious question, rather than deflect it with something easy. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "But I know it isn't what your husband wanted. I have no interest in owning something. I'm interested in what you are." He paused. "I think those are different things." "They are," she said. "But the difference has to be proven, not stated." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the gravity of a man making a commitment he intends to keep. "Then I'll prove it," he said. She did not smile. She was not there yet, and she was not going to perform being there before she was. But something in her that had been tightly, necessarily closed, something that had learned to protect itself through the long discipline of hoping for less and receiving it, shifted. Not opened, not yet, but shifted. Terry Dawson had stood at a window 60 floors above a rain-soaked city and said goodbye to a version of herself she no longer recognized. The woman who had compressed her needs into silence. The woman who had measured love by how much absence she could absorb. The woman who had stayed long past the point where staying served her, because leaving required a belief in herself that neglect had spent 3 years quietly eroding. That woman had put down a ring on a cold marble surface and walked into an elevator and not looked back. And the woman who came out on the other side was harder in the places that needed to be hard and softer only where she chose to be soft. She had built something, not yet complete, not grand, but genuinely and entirely her own. An apartment with no one else's aesthetic imposed on it. Work that asked for her actual intelligence. Mornings that belonged to her. A life that was not a performance of endurance dressed up as a marriage. Her husband had called once more, 2 weeks after the lobby. She had answered. He had sounded quieter than she had ever heard him, stripped of the particular confidence that comes from never having faced a consequence. He said he understood. She did not know if that was true. She knew it was, at minimum, too late, and she told him so without cruelty. Young Chul remained present in the way he had promised, at a distance that respected her terms, in increments she could manage, without demanding access she had not offered. He sent no declarations, made no dramatic gestures. He appeared when she indicated she was open to it, and did not appear when she was not, which in itself told her more about his character than most men revealed in years. He had shown her, through specific and quietly remarkable means, what it looked like when a man's attention was rooted in genuine regard, rather than the desire to possess something that impressed him. She did not trust it completely. Not yet. She was not sure she was built for complete trust anymore, and she was honest with herself about that. But she was no longer closed to it either, and the distance between closed and open, however narrow, was the distance she had fought 3 years to travel. One evening, she stood at the window of her own apartment, smaller than the penthouse, without the 60-floor view, the city visible but not dominant, and she looked at her reflection in the glass. She looked like herself, not the version that had been slowly furnished with someone else's indifference, not the version that had learned to make herself smaller so the room would be more comfortable for a man who wasn't paying attention. The real version, the one with edges and intelligence, and the particular kind of beauty that comes from a woman who has decided she is done apologizing for taking up space. She looked at her reflection for a long time. Then she smiled. Small, private, and entirely for herself, and turned away from the window. She was not waiting to be seen anymore. She was already here,